tēnei ata, e hui nei ki te whiti kōrero, mō tō tātou kaupapa. E mihi ana a Ara Ake kia koutou katoa, a manuhiri tuārangi, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm going to share a karakia for us today, a reflection. Some might say it's philosophical reflection, and it's a recounting of a traditional Māori view of the world and of the cosmos and humanity's relationship in place within there. It acknowledges the sky and elements of the air and the earth and elements of the terrestrial and celestial elements, actually. So I'll just share that karakia with us this morning. Ko rangi, ko papa, ka puta, ko rongo, ko tāne mahuta, ko tangaroa, ko tū mātauenga, ko haumi e tiki tiki, ko tā uri mātea. Toko na te rangi ki runga, ko papa tuanuku ki raro, ka puta tātou te ira tangata ki te whai au, ki te ao mārama, ki hei mauri ora. Tēnā tātou katoa, over to you, Jonathan.
Hey, thanks so much, Will. Dr. Will Edwards is the head of Māori partnerships from Ara Ake, and brings a great sense of connection, which is absolutely fantastic. Hey, welcome everybody. Just going to briefly share my screen, and would like to welcome our special guests, but also everybody who is joining to participate in this forum. I'm Jonathan Young. I'm head of industry and government engagement at Ara Ake. I'm convener of what's called the Ara Ake Forum, which is hosting this webinar today, and we count it a great privilege to do that. The Ara Ake Forum started 3 years ago, meets on a monthly basis, usually for 1 hour. It's designed to connect people across the energy innovation ecosystem with a mix of government agencies and innovation companies, with the aim of fostering collaboration in advancing innovation that can reduce emissions and decarbonise our economy. So we're very happy to host this webinar today. Just looking at our program, which was sent out to you yesterday, but let me just highlight a couple of things. Will has welcomed us for a presentation from Dr. Jono Barnard, Jacob Snelgrove, Billie Moore, Georgina Blane, and Scott Carey today, and then Billie's going to do some wrap-up comments, and I will close the webinar around the midday-ish. The forum is being recorded. There are a number of people who can't attend, who would really like and appreciate to be able to watch it at a later stage. Each session is 20 minutes, including Q&A. We have the Slido app been activated for questions, and we're going to take all questions through the Slido app. And you go to slido.com and enter the event code 2920298. The most upvoted questions will be prioritised, so upvote questions you want answered. And questions will be asked by Rosie Condon, the facilitator, at the end of each presentation. If your question doesn't get asked, it will be forwarded to the person that you're directed to after the forum. So as I said before, these are our speakers, and we're delighted to have them here today. I'm going to now introduce you to Dr. Jono Barnard, who's going to start off. He's our Research and Insights Manager at Ara Ake. Jono, I'm going to stop sharing and hand control to you. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you for the intro, Jonathan, and thank you for everyone attending. So what I know, my name is Jono Barnard. I'm the Research and Insights Manager here at Ara Ake, and today I'm going to be talking to you all about the work which we recently conducted on the technical options to decarbonise domestic aviation. So to start off, I'm aware that there are probably quite a number of you online who aren't familiar with Ara Ake. We are New Zealand's Future Energy Centre. We're an independent organisation funded by MB, and we are mandated to accelerate the demonstration, commercialisation and deployment of energy innovation in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We focus on the energy transition through the lens of the energy trilemma, trilemma, that being sustainability, equity and resilience, and we take a whole of energy systems approach to try and achieve real world impact. So the first question is, why did we do an aviation report? At Ara Ake, we have a number of key functions, and these include sharing research and insights to better understand energy sector problems, commercialization opportunities, and innovation challenges or barriers. We also have a focus on bringing together different parts of the ecosystem to help better address these problems. And it goes without saying that decarbonising a hard-to-abate sector like aviation is clearly an energy sector problem. So there are a number of potential solutions, but there's a lot of noise, and depending on who you actually talk to, a lot of controversy surrounding one solution in particular. So in the last couple of years, green hydrogen as a solution for aviation's carbon problem has been discussed at length by government organisations and the aviation industry, whilst also being faced with a lot of opposition saying that decarbonising aviation with hydrogen is a hoax. So who do you believe, given the commercial interests on both sides of the argument? And to address this, we decided as an independent organisation with no commercial interests and simply an interest in accelerating New Zealand's decarbonisation journey to have a look at the physics of low emissions flight. This way we could show whether it is energetically possible for hydrogen or other low emissions alternatives to replace jet fuel across the New Zealand domestic network, as well as highlight any of the challenges which will need to be addressed going forward. So over the next few slides, I'll be summarising our findings, but one thing I do want to note is that the report itself is quite technical, so I'll only be presenting the result at a high level, but for those of you wanting to dive into the details, you can find the report on our website. So to set the scene, here are some stats. Domestic aviation in New Zealand contributed over 1,000 kilotons of CO2 equivalent emissions in 2022. For context, that's around 7.5% of transport emissions, 3.5% of energy sector emissions, and just over 1% of national gross emissions. These numbers are the result of around 200,000 flights per year, where 16 million passengers travel around 80 million kilometres up and down the country. In regard to vast long distance travel within New Zealand, flight is among the only options we currently have due to limited rail services and other long distance alternatives. And as a result, we have among the highest per capita domestic aviation emissions globally, with the OECD listing the top 6 per capita emitters as the Seychelles, New Zealand in second, followed by Kiribati, the Maldives, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and then the United States. Also, something worth noting is that the emission values presented on this slide were released after we published our report, and it's really interesting to see that year on year domestic aviation emissions have nearly increased 25%, and not only that, but to a higher level relative to the rest of the energy sector than before COVID. So this really shows a strong industry bounce back, and as easier to abate sectors of the economy such as light road vehicles are being decarbonised, domestic aviation's relative portion of national emissions will continue to increase over time. Let's now jump in and have a quick look at the kind of aircraft which are currently operating in New Zealand, contributing to these 200,000 or so domestic flights. There are 4 main types of aircraft operating, and these are the Airbus A320, ATR 72, Bombardier Dash Q300, and other miscellaneous small planes. The A320 is the largest plane, carrying around 170 passengers, and as one would expect, flies the longest routes on average and typically connects all of the main centres across the country, so Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch. The ATR 72 and Dash Q300 aircraft are almost used interchangeably and cater to the regions, carrying around 50 and 70 passengers each. And then finally, small aircraft in the domestic fleet only fly the shortest routes, carrying less than 12 people and travelling less than 200 kilometres. So we now have some context behind why domestic aviation emissions are a key problem in New Zealand. And we also understand what kinds of aircraft are being flown, how far they're being flown, and how many passengers they're typically carrying. So as most of us are probably aware, combustion of liquid fossil fuel called Jet A is the primary method to provide energy to the domestic and international aviation fleet to travel from A to B. However, as we transition to a low carbon economy, we'll need to consider the various options we have to reduce aviation emissions. This is typically viewed through the avoid, shift, improve framework, which essentially shows that aviation emission reduction opportunities exist in the form of avoiding business or personal travel, shifting to alternative low emissions transport such as rail, or through improving plane technology through the use of low carbon sources of energy. The work we did focused on the 3 typical options being considered to improve aviation emissions, and those are green hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuel or SAF, and electrochemical batteries. When looking at the emissions reduction potential of these technologies, you find that both green hydrogen batteries would achieve in excess of a 90% reduction in emissions. However, with SAF, it very much depends on how it's made and what it's made with. There are 4 key processes to make SAF, and each process has a number of potential feedstocks. The most typical today is the hydroprocessing of esters and fatty acids, or HEFA, and an example feedstock for this is used cooking oil, or UCO, which can achieve an emissions reduction of around 80% when compared to jet fuel. The second process is called Fischer-Tropsch, which is the conversion of solid residues into liquid fuel using a number of chemical reactions. The third is powder SAF, which is to produce eSAF through combining green hydrogen and captured CO2. And finally, alcohol to jet, or A to J, is the conversion of biologically derived ethanol from corn, for example, into a low emissions jet fuel alternative. So irrespective of the process chosen, SAF emissions reduction potential varies widely, but when accounting for the main feedstock, the averages achieved is 63% for HEFA, 77% for Fischer-Tropsch, and 51% for A to J. So there are obvious pathways which we could use to decarbonize aviation. So what's stopping us from just quickly building planes with new technology or quickly phasing out fossil jet fuel with low emissions alternatives? And unfortunately, the answer is a lot of things, and that's summarized by the 3 points below. Batteries are too heavy. Hydrogen isn't too heavy, but is very complicated as an aviation energy carrier. And SAF isn't very complicated, but we all need the same ingredients, and there isn't enough to go around. To understand the problem with batteries, we need to consider what has to be true for a plane to fly. Crucially to aviation, reducing the emissions of the domestic fleet requires utilizing an aircraft with a propulsion system which has sufficient energy available on board to both fly the desired leg to meet any legal reserve requirements, whilst also complying with design takeoff and landing weights. We conducted an assessment looking at the weight of each aircraft. If it were to fly the average domestic route using a given technology, then this weight was compared to the design requirements. Obviously, Jet A and SAF meet those requirements, as does liquid hydrogen, but the same can't be said for a system based off electrochemical batteries, as they have a very low energy density, where around 50 kgs of batteries is needed to provide the same amount of energy as 1 kg of jet fuel. Because of this, if batteries replace the incumbent liquid fuel systems in planes in today's fleet, and these planes wanted to travel the same distances with the same number of passengers, these battery electric aircraft would exceed their design takeoff and landing weights by close to 100%. So in other words, these planes would be twice as heavy as their jet fuel counterparts, and it's likely that both performance and safety would be significantly compromised, keeping these aircraft firmly on the ground. However, something which is important to consider is even though battery electric aircraft at this scale won't work today across the domestic network, is it likely that advances in battery technology could make this a possibility in the future? To understand this, we conducted an analysis on each individual route flown by Air New Zealand using a specific type of aircraft, and the results show that the specific energy of batteries would need to increase 24 times compared to today to cover all domestic routes. So what does this actually mean? If we consider a pre-commercial lithium oxygen battery, which has among the highest maximum theoretical energy densities at 4,000 watt-hours per kg, this is a 16-time increase on today's batteries, and importantly, the realistically achievable specific energy when commercialized is expected to be around half that. So to answer the question, tomorrow's batteries are also too heavy, and it's unlikely that we'll be seeing battery electric flights with similar passenger numbers to today traveling long distances up and down the country. As I mentioned previously, hydrogen as an aviation energy carrier does meet the weight requirements due to having a very high specific energy, 3 times that of Jet A. However, to fit the necessary mass of hydrogen on board a plane, the gas has to be cryogenically cooled and liquefied prior to fueling and then held at this temperature of minus 250 degrees Celsius during the flight. This is key complication number 1. So if we assume that the plane can be fueled with and store liquid hydrogen, the density of it is very low, so it takes up a lot of space. This means that to fly a typical domestic flight using hydrogen, the fuel tank would have to be more than 2/3 full. This is complication number 2, as there would have to be hydrogen refueling infrastructure at the aircraft's destination in order to make the return trip. The third complication is how do you even store hydrogen on an aircraft? For a typical plane, jet fuel is stored in the wings. However, you can't do this with liquid hydrogen due to the very low temperatures which need to be maintained during flight. Instead, cylindrical vessels would have to be installed in the fuselage, which is the main body of the plane where you typically sit. So of course, in today's aircraft aren't designed with this in mind, but it's interesting to consider whether a future domestic fleet with purpose-built liquid hydrogen tanks could fly the same number of flights and transport the same number of passengers around the country as we do today. Taking inspiration from the International Council on Clean Transportation, aircraft could be retrofit such that seats in the fuselage were replaced with hydrogen tanks. If this were done today, obviously passenger numbers would have to reduce, but if we replaced current aircraft in the fleet with the next size up, for example, replacing a Q300 with an ATR-72, would we be able to operate a similar domestic network to today, but powered by hydrogen? And the modelling says, yes, we could, but that's assuming passenger numbers stay constant over time. It also goes without saying that if green hydrogen were prioritised for domestic aviation, new planes designed specifically for liquid hydrogen storage, which Jake will probably touch on later, will likely be purchased rather than retrofitting hydrogen tanks into existing jet fuel planes. Of all the decarbonisation options for both domestic and international aviation, SAF makes the most sense as very little has to change. As a drop-in fuel, there's no need for new planes, there's no need for new fueling infrastructure, there's no need for new safety regulation, the list goes on. However, that is only relevant if we can make enough of it to meet demand and make it out of something which meaningfully decreases emissions. Used cooking oil is the major SAF feedstock today, which can achieve significant emissions reductions. However, when considering the total amount of SAF, which could be produced from the maximum likely future supply of used cooking oil, although it would be enough to decarbonise New Zealand's domestic aviation sector, it would require using nearly 2% of global supply to meet less than 0.1% of global demand. So rather than simply just relying on UCO SAF imports, it's important to ask the question whether there are local feedstocks which could be used to produce SAF. From conversations we've had with Neste, the SAF producer who are supplying Air New Zealand, they identified us as the 5th best location in the world to produce SAF from waste woody biomass. Importantly, however, they haven't considered that there may be other players also looking at using the same biomass to reduce emissions across other sectors. So the ultimate question from an NZ Inc. perspective is who gets what? We could decarbonise domestic aviation using 72% of New Zealand's available waste woody biomass supply, but this only accounts for 10% of liquid fuel demand. So although, yes, in theory, there's sufficient supply to meet demand, should this feedstock be used to decarbonise domestic aviation, or is it potentially more appropriate to use it to reduce the emissions of other hard-to-abate sectors with no obvious technical alternatives? The examples being international aviation and shipping. So finally, what about eSAF? Through the power to SAF pathway, we have none of the typical feedstock constraints due to the fuels being produced from effectively water and air. However, the most important consideration is how much power you need. To produce eSAF, green hydrogen must first be produced via electrolysis, and carbon dioxide must be forcefully separated from the atmosphere before being able to produce a jet fuel alternative. To meet projected domestic aviation demand, eSAF would require 24 terawatt hours of electricity per year. Today, New Zealand's electricity use as a nation is 43 terawatt hours. And to meet this eSAF demand, we would have to build generation equivalent to 6 gigawatts of offshore wind or 83 co-fi parks, which is the solar farm being built near Christchurch Airport. So where do we go from here? The work we've conducted from a technical perspective has identified potential options to replace jet fuel in New Zealand's domestic aviation sector. However, despite the physics being favourable in some cases, there are still critical barriers to overcome, as these options and the industries associated with them are all currently pre-commercial. Ultimately, to understand whether green hydrogen, SAF, or a combination of the two should be used to decarbonise domestic aviation, everyone in the energy and aviation ecosystems must work together to enable and accelerate the transition to a low emissions aviation future in New Zealand. Ara Ake are keen to innovate and collaborate, so please, if you have any ideas on things you'd like to test, any problems you'd like to investigate, or are interested in learning by doing or piloting innovative technology, please reach out to us. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Jono. We just have one question that's just popped up. When, if ever, will costs be comparable?
So in the report, there is a section on economics, and I purposely didn't address this because of everything which would have to be covered. So we have at the moment some estimates of how much each of these fuels cost if you were just going to make them. When I say fuels, I mean energy carriers. We have an understanding of how much they will cost, but we don't have an understanding of all of the infrastructure costs, so new planes, for example, hydrogen infrastructure, even battery charging infrastructure, for example, upgrades to the grid, etc. When costs will come comparable, that is a question which I don't currently have the answer to, and it's probably still yet to be seen, especially when you consider the entire levelized cost. I think is the most important thing here, because we're not just dealing with making new energy carriers, you have to do everything else at the same time as well.
Great, thank you. We've got time for another question here. How can we leverage off countries like Singapore?
So this is quite interesting. So I mentioned in my talk that we spoke to Neste, and they have a plant in heifer plant in Singapore, and at the moment they are actually one of their feedstocks is tallow, and that actually is coming from New Zealand. So at Port Taranaki, one of the tanks is full of tallow, and that gets shipped to Singapore. The problem we will have in New Zealand is unless the market is incentivized to use SAF, people who are producing SAF will sell to other countries. So countries where there are guaranteed buyers, so places with mandates, for example, Europe and America. And I know that in New Zealand, for example, all of their SAF is being sent to California because I believe there is a mandate or a rebate from using SAF there. So that is something which we would have to look at doing. So obviously there's potential for there to be a two-way partnership between New Zealand and Singapore, especially from a hydrogen perspective, if we were to go ahead with doing shipping hydrogen offshore. But that's an entirely different kettle of fish. So yeah, I think it's up to the market needs to have incentives for that conversation to even start.
Cool, thank you. We have one more question here, but I'll pass that over to you, Jono, separately to answer and feedback to the audience.
Awesome.
Jonathan, I'll hand it back to you for the next presentation.
Yeah, hey, thanks so much, Jono, and thanks, Rosie. an excellent presentation. Thank you for the good work you're doing in this space. It's brilliant. So now we are going to welcome Jacob Snelgrove from Air New Zealand, Senior Sustainability Manager, Next Generation Aircraft. Love the sound of that. So Jake's going to present on Air New Zealand's decarbonisation strategy, targets, and their Next Generation Aircraft program. So over to you, Jake. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks, Jonathan. I'll present. Hopefully this works. That was a great intro from Jono. It sort of saved me having to relitigate a lot of that explanation. That's really helpful. So what I was going to cover off in this 15 minutes was a bit on Air New Zealand's decarbonisation targets, and then focus quickly on our SAF and Next Generation Aircraft programs, which obviously Jono's kind of introed in terms of how they work and where the opportunities and challenges lie. Air New Zealand in 2020 set a net zero carbon emissions target for 2050, which at the time was in line with what a lot of other airlines were doing. And then shortly after that, in 2021, we set a science-based target to reduce our carbon intensity by 28.9% by 2030. And that's something that not a lot of airlines globally have done. We were the second airline to set one of those, and it is a real stretch, ambitious target for us to get to, and that is a measure of carbon over the revenue ton kilometres, so that's passengers and freight that we carry. So it's an efficiency metric for us to get to by 2030. In order for us to get there, the pathway is very challenging, but we're relying on these 5 levers I've got on the screen, and I think Jono did was really good at describing the challenges and uncertainty that all of these different levers present us, and we're quite aware that there is no silver bullet, there is no easy answer, and there is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of risk. So we're trying to do everything we can across all of them to keep all of the options alive and to explore and to try and enable these the best we can. And ultimately, at the end of the day, somewhere along the way, there will be, roadblocks, there will be, accelerants that will change, I guess, the weighting of some of these levers. But SAF and Next Generation Aircraft, the first 2 levers there on the left, I'll obviously spend a bit more time talking about, but the ones on the right are worth pausing on as well, because the airline industry in fleet renewal has done a pretty incredible job to date to make aircraft ever so more efficient. However, here at Air New Zealand, we have one of the newest fleets in the world, and a lot of the low-hanging fruit for us is pretty much gone. We're operating a really efficient wide-body fleet. Our domestic fleet is of, essentially the newest generation of aircraft you could get. So in terms of unlocking more conventional efficiencies from gas turbines, it's quite a difficult next 10 to 15 years for us, because a lot of other airlines are still acquiring these aircraft. We've kind of done a lot of that already. So the fleet renewal level, while important, is one which yields, the juice in the lemon is kind of running out for us in that one for the next couple of decades. Operational efficiency is a really interesting one. That's how we operate our aircraft. That goes from anything from pilot procedures, ground operations, the use of smart airspace efficiency tools, and that is going to yield some efficiency benefits, but it's kind of at the margins in terms of what's achievable. And then carbon removals is an area we are turning more attention to, accepting the fact that in 2050 there's no real pathway which will see us achieving gross zero emissions, and a removals strategy is going to be fundamental to us on that journey. Just to quickly paint a picture of how our emissions profile looks across the network. I know Jono's presentation focused a lot on the domestic network, but we've do have the other 2 parts of our network, which are the Tasman Pacific Island network, which is sort of our international short-range flights, and then we have our long-haul network, which reaches Asia and in the US. And what this chart shows is the cumulative increase in passenger numbers, number of departures, and emissions. And you can see the domestic network, in terms of the distance it goes along the bottom axis, only represents about 20% of our total emissions as an airline, but it does represent up to 80% of our departures or the number of flights we do, and 60% of our passenger count. And this is a really interesting area for us, which has seen us put a lot of effort into exploring what we call next generation aircraft, or hybrid battery and hydrogen aircraft, because we see by 2050 the opportunity kind of being constrained within that domestic sort of sector length. When we get to that Tasman Pacific Island network, that's another 20% of our emissions count. It's about 20% of our passenger numbers and about 10% of the flights we do. And that, in some, when you talk to the likes of Airbus, Boeing, and Embraer, there is a world in the future where you may have a liquid hydrogen powered aircraft able to do sector lengths up to 2,000 nautical miles, but that would be hydrogen combustion. But we're yet to see a lot of concrete plans for that start to evolve. So in this sector, we're very much reliant on sustainable aviation fuel to decarbonise. And then in that longer and bigger block there, which is our long haul network, that's 60% of our emissions. It's 10% of the flights we do and 20% of the passengers we carry, but a very large disproportionate amount of the emissions that we generate. And that obviously is critical to New Zealand due to the unfortunate geographic location in some ways, being so far away from the world. The carbon intensity of long haul flying is really apparent here. And there's a real break between short range and long range flying, which a lot of other airlines don't have. They sort of have a lot of mixed in the middle. And for long haul, we will be totally reliant on sustainable aviation fuel to 2050 to try and decarbonise that 60% of our emissions. When we talk about SAF, we really, as Jono outlined, is a catch-all phrase for a drop-in carbon-based liquid fuel, which could be derived from a biomass feedstock and electricity feedstock. It is a total life cycle reduction in emissions. And for us, we have a dedicated team focused on this internally, and like many airlines now globally, is becoming a fight for every drop of sustainable aviation fuel you can find. So we have a 4-pronged kind of approach to trying to unlock this. We've set a public target to have 10% sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. And currently, globally, sustainable aviation fuel last year was less than 1%. I think it was about 0.5% of global fuel supply. So there is a significant ramp up in supply that has to occur by 2030 for a lot of airlines now to meet the 10% SAF by 2030 targets. To do that, we are looking at both domestic production here in New Zealand imports, and international uplift. And if I just talk to each of those quickly, for domestic production, we have a agreement in place with MB to explore feasibility around 2 types of sustainable aviation fuel production, one using wooded biomass, one using municipal solid waste. And there is, I think, Jono, you noted it, there is a real interesting opportunity here in New Zealand for us to explore in terms of how we produce sustainable aviation fuel here, especially when we start to look at PTL as well, power to liquid fuels. With New Zealand imports, we have been importing sustainable aviation fuel now for, we've done that a couple of times. It is a very expensive and inefficient way to import, to use sustainable aviation fuel because of the long supply chain that it relies on and the associated costs. You're looking at jet fuel premiums of between 2 to 5 times the price of jet fuel, which is why we are so currently focused on our international uplift strategy. So this is so much of that. If you imagine 60% of our emissions come from our long haul network, 30% of that is from an international destination. The other 30% comes from New Zealand, but the other 30 comes from ports all over the world. So whether that's Singapore, California, i.e. Los Angeles and San Francisco, we have quite a lot of fuel coming out of those locations where sustainable aviation fuel is currently produced and is at a much more affordable price, especially in California, as Jono noted, where they have state government and federal government incentives that bring the cost of sustainable aviation fuel down to close to price parity. But we're not the only airline to know that, and there is a lot of, I guess, competition for that supply into kind of the next decade. So because airlines are really looking to get it where they can make it price comparable. The other one is advocacy and collaboration, and that's around working with governments and our government here in New Zealand to advocate for policies which are going to enable the production and a level playing field for SAF. So we are advocating for a SAF mandate here in New Zealand to level the playing field and make sure that we create the market demand signals that are required for people to make sustainable aviation fuel here, but also to incentivize other airlines, well, to force other airlines to be as ambitious as what we're trying to be here to drive the supply of SAF. With next generation aircraft, this is something that we are relying on, or not relying on, rather, we're exploring for our domestic network. Sustainable aviation fuel is a lot more certain in terms of its science, its supply is starting to evolve. We're never going to get enough SAF to decarbonize our whole network in all likelihood in the net, by 2050 it's going to be a stretch. So there is a need for us to look at other alternatives, and this next generation aircraft bit is an opportunity that we see as being quite interesting for New Zealand. And the reasons for that are there's sort of three key drivers that have seen us double down in this area over the last few years. The first of them is the makeup of our domestic network. So we have a very short range, I guess the proportion of flights that we fly domestically are very short range. And that chart there, which is a little difficult to read, shows that 60% of our turboprop flights, which are those ATR and Q300 aircraft that Jono described before, fly flights that are under 350 kilometers. And that's in the current network already quite a big proportion of our network that would be suitable to initially payload and range constrained aircraft that are powered by battery hybrid or hydrogen type solutions. The other one, which is a real big selling point to aircraft developers overseas, is the grid here in New Zealand. And I think we're as equally as terrified as everyone else around how we electrify here over the next, to 2050 in terms of the ramp up required across the energy sector to decarbonize. But because the grid already is over 80% renewable, it's a real selling point to international companies that are making aircraft that want to, bring early demonstration or early platforms to a country where the grid is already quite mature in terms of its ability to adopt close to, zero scope 1 emissions type aircraft. The other one is the long-term strategic value in us investing a lot in this area and trying to electrify aviation because of the limited substitutes here in New Zealand. Where if you're in Europe or parts of the US where there are extensive high-speed rail networks connecting large population centers, big motorway systems, and infrastructure to support a ground-based substitute, then investing in electrifying aviation may not be something that makes a lot of strategic value. Where here in New Zealand, the way we're kind of viewing it is the smaller population centres we have dispersed around really challenging geography make the long-term value of electrifying aviation something worth doing. New Zealanders fly in the top 5 flights per capita in the OECD, and that is because of a lot of this challenge around getting around New Zealand, and we kind of think we offer a public good, so it's upon us and incumbent on us to take a leadership position here to electrify this, to be able to offer Kiwis a way to get around the country without the associated emissions. What we've been doing on the next generation aircraft side has been a long journey that started back in 2018 when we began to investigate replacing our Dash 8 Q300. We decided then to extend the lifetime of that aircraft as we were seeing a lot of these new aircraft concepts emerge, which were worthy of further investigation. And since then, we've signed MOUs with ATR and Airbus to look at both hydrogen fuel cell, hydrogen combustion, and a battery hybrid option for the ATR. In 2021, we released what we called a PRD, which was essentially an expression of interest to aircraft developers globally making alternative propulsion aircraft. And we got over 30 different aircraft companies respond. Unfortunately, none from this part of the world, but companies from around the US and Europe. And they ranged anything from a small startup to obviously the big incumbent OEMs like Boeing, Embraer, Airbus, ATR, for example. Out of that, we learned some real lessons ourselves. The key one was that an airline like us has a bigger role to play in advocating for this new technology, because without airlines signaling the market demand, the startups won't get access to the capital they need to advance the technology, and the incumbent OEMs won't prioritize their internal resources to advance the progress needed for that tech. So in 2022, we put out a public ambition, which we called our Mission Next Gen aircraft, to fly or to find a replacement for our Dash 8 Q300 fleet in the 2030s, powered by hydrogen or battery electric technology. And we also announced a plan to fly what we called a commercial demonstrator in 2026. And the point of that demonstrator, which we announced at the end of last year, in order for one Beta Alea, which is an all-battery electric aircraft, to arrive in 2026, is not to suddenly see New Zealand get into flying smaller aircraft, but instead it's a plan to advance the change required across the industry, whether that is airport infrastructure, aviation regulations, social license, you name it. The changes we need to occur are quite significant before we can commit to buying a 2030 aircraft size fleet of aircraft to replace our Q300. So we're looking to trial the technology as early as we can with the smaller scale tech, which is much lower risk to us and gives us the right platform to trial and learn from. And I think that's probably me close to time, so I can finish it up there and take any questions that might have arisen.
Thank you, Jacob. We don't have any questions yet.
Right.
You must have covered it. Feel free. We've got someone's just put their hand up. You're welcome to speak, David.
Oh, good morning, everybody. And sorry, I'm not on camera. I didn't do my hair this morning. So, hey, look, Jacob and Jono, very, very quickly. I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but obviously the Q300 replacement is looming. I know that it's sort of 8 to 10 years away to when those aircraft won't be on the network, but we are seeing some reliability issues with them just in the network. As a airport operator, I'm a bit nervous that we're not going to have those in the fleet and there won't be a replacement ready in time. Has there been any thought given to that at all?
Yep, certainly has been. It's been a big focus of ours, David, and we're quite appreciative of the challenges the Q300 might have thrown up. There's nothing wrong fundamentally with the aircraft. It's a parts issue with de Havilland and sourcing parts from them. And the way that we replace that aircraft is very much not waiting for a next gen aircraft to appear before we start to replace it. How that gets replaced could take a multitude of different pathways. There could be starting to supplement some of that aircraft with a more conventional aircraft design like an ATR. It could see us moving to smaller aircraft if that was to be available sooner than a more like-for-like replacement. The other option too is ATR are making a lot of headway on it's a hybrid ATR, which would be anticipated available from sort of 2030. And there may be, there's all sorts of interesting fleet levers you can pull to ensure that you've got a reliable fleet operating domestically, but trying to do everything we can to keep that fleet replacement window open so that we can find something of an alternative propulsion source to replace it with. But yeah, very appreciative of your point there.
Right. Thank you very much.
Right. Hey, thanks, David. Great to hear the Plymouth voice come through. Hey, thanks, Jake. That was really, really interesting. And just thank you very much for your contribution to this morning's webinar. Now we're going to come to Billie Moore and Georgina Blane. Billie is Chief Executive of New Zealand Airports Association, and Georgina is Sustainability Manager at Wellington Airport. So, Billie, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much. It's all, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. And I think, you know, we work very closely with Air New Zealand, so let's be agile in how we address questions coming up, because I'm sure there'll be more questions that might be addressed by both myself, Wellington Airport, and Jacob. So yeah, do keep those coming. Look, first off, thanks so much for the opportunity. Thanks, Ara Ake, for putting work into this issue. We are grateful for it. Any work from agencies and organisations like yours in the aviation space is most welcome at the moment. In terms of NZ Airports, we are the industry association for airports around New Zealand. We look at the system level. So aviation, as you've already seen, is an ecosystem. We all rely on each other. We all rely on the system working together. And we look across that ecosystem. So my role as CE when it comes to sustainability work and decarbonisation is really to see, you know, are the settings right? Is the engagement right? Are we going to get where we need to go? And I do that work both for the airports and also as part of Sustainable Aviation Aotearoa. I do want to start off by thanking Jacob and Air New Zealand for their work. The EOI process for the Beta Alea aircraft has been one of those key kind of linch points for the airport network and being able to test their readiness for new technology. And it's the kind of processes that we really need to start getting into the practicalities of decarbonisation. All right. Look, I won't labour this point too much, but I have to do a little bit of it. We recently lodged our submission with the Climate Change Commission on whether and how international emissions, international aviation and maritime emissions should be included in the 2050 target. And we saw a range of views on those questions, but I think almost all submissions will have a variation on one theme, which is that there is an urgent need for greater government engagement on aviation decarbonisation. And knowing that there are many agencies on this call, I have to take the time to reinforce that theme. We see this as a nation-building issue for New Zealand, and you only need to look at those maps to understand why. It's an economic issue, a trade issue. Our aviation system supports not just passengers and tourism, but the freight that we all rely on for both imports and exports. Everything that's enabled by connection. It's a resilience issue, regional development, a global market issue. The rest of the world is moving faster than us on this one. And of course, most importantly, an environmental issue. This session, you'll see, highlights some of the work the industry is doing, but I thought I'd add a little bit more system context and highlight essentially the things that keep me up at night on this stuff. Jacob has talked already about how important this is to New Zealand, our geography. These images sum it up. We've got challenging geography. We need this to maintain any form of a modern lifestyle for New Zealanders. So how to think about the airport's role in all of this? This is how I kind of visually think about it in my mind, and where you'll see airports interacting with these processes around the country. Airports around the country are assessing the work they can do within current available technology to first reduce the emissions within their control. As we all know, scope 1 and 2 emissions. Airports are critical infrastructure. They are built infrastructure. They involve land use, resource planning. They're thinking about how they can reduce their own emissions. Then providing the enabling infrastructure for airlines and other stakeholders on the airport precinct to decarbonise. They have a really important role in working with stakeholders like Air New Zealand to make that network transition happen. And then there's a third piece that we don't often talk about much, but I think we need to talk about more, which is that airports as regional infrastructure can contribute to the transition needs of their regions and communities. They are infrastructure that has a commercial and industrial element to them already, and we can think about the way that they can support renewable energy generation and the types of infrastructure that we're going to need to see around the country to support all sectors' decarbonisation. The other key thing to remember is that airports are master planners. They think 30 to 50 years in advance, even without this issue being there. So that leads them to always be thinking in a long-term strategic manner about how their services might need to adapt to the needs of communities and New Zealand over time. So they're already really well placed to partner on issues around emissions reduction because they are enabled to have that long-term outlook. My main message really is that airports are getting on with it wherever they can. And you'll see that reflected in Georgina's comments to follow. We already have, quite a number of airports, Auckland, Christchurch, Hawke's Bay, Palmerston North and Hamilton, already at the highest level international accreditations for emissions reduction for Scope 1 and 2 and for their partnership approach on Scope 3. So we are getting, international best in class on this work already. Wellington has also reached equivalent levels, and you'll see some of that from Georgina shortly. By way of example, in 2021, Christchurch has already achieved 94% absolute GHG reductions from a 2015 baseline. Auckland Airport is on a pathway to 90% reduction by 2030, and others already in the same kind of frame. Regional airports as well are playing their part in extraordinary ways. We've got Hamilton and Gisborne already with solar farms operating to power terminals, ancillary buildings, and in Gisborne's case, community renewable energy needs, and other regional airports are pursuing similar projects. Here you can see just a snapshot of some of the variety of things that you'll see airports working on. We've got the images from the Hydrogen Consortium that Air New Zealand is a partner in, and also Christchurch Airport with other partners, including, of course, Airbus. Up in the top right, you've got Gisborne Airport and their Te Ihi o Te Rā solar farm, which is on the airport precinct and supporting their community energy needs. Bottom left, Hamilton solar farm, which powers the airport buildings, and I'm sure will continue to grow. In the middle and the bottom there is Gisborne as well. Their airport development is at the highest level of living building standards. So there's all sorts to look at in terms of Gisborne's development. There's a wonderful fire truck there, Rosenbauer fire trucks. If you've ever been to get close to those on the airport precinct, they are pretty impressive beasts, and Christchurch has ordered the first electric powered fire truck, which will be fascinating to see that on the airport precinct in coming years. Another practical example, and in the bottom right, there's Manawa Bay. So that's Auckland Airport's, some of their non-aeronautical work. So airports obviously have aeronautical and non-aeronautical developments, and so the same kind of strategies are being applied to some of their commercial developments. Manawa Bay is a shopping centre that's being built with solar panels on top and will reach the highest standards as well. Amidst all of that, it's also important to highlight there are many airports who can't invest in decarbonisation measures without support. Most airports are local government owned in some form, and many operate on non-commercial terms in order to provide resilience and connection for their communities. So they will be relying on system efforts and government intervention to be a part of this transition. So there are lots of good stories to tell, but it's important to remember that the scale of this work requires network solutions, and it is going to be a massive process. This transition has to support the system's viability and scale. Because we are a user pays system, we have to keep the scale in the system to remain profitable to be able to fund decarbonisation. So that's why we have a really strong focus on technology enablement. We look at the no regrets moves that airports can take now that will always be helpful in the future scenarios for decarbonisation. I have total confidence that Airlines like Air New Zealand and airports are making good decisions in this space at the moment. It's the system level that is the part that needs the boost, I think, at the moment. And that's why I have this meme, essentially to make the point that there are some things where we just don't have a clear pathway yet on how we're going to achieve it at the system, particularly how the way the system interacts with the government agencies that are, of course, extremely stretched and under cost pressure. Key issues for me are we need to connect our aviation strategy with our renewable energy strategy. And I think Jono made that point really effectively. Those are not two different things. We must all be around the same table. The officials must be the same. We must be the same agencies. There is no point in having discussions separately anymore. Projected energy demand from aviation, and Jono made the point that it will be massive, isn't in any renewable energy target for New Zealand or any generation or transmission planning yet. That work needs to be done now. Our transition also relies on sustainable funding solutions for local government. I made the point earlier, we need to find a way of ensuring that local government can invest and that there are sustainable funding flows from central government. We have to look at SAF in terms of our national interests and place in the global market. Points well made earlier as well. We are falling behind on SAF policy and we need to, I think, probably at this point start leveraging some of Australia's investment in that space. And even things that might seem as basic as regulation take a lot of time and effort and are really, really important for aviation. As you all know, aviation relies on safety as the core pillar of the sector and the confidence of the public. So if we can't get regulations that fit with novel aircraft and the alternative fuels that we'll be using, we might find that a barrier to transition. Really just making that same point again that airports are at place, they're thinking long term about this stuff. So thinking about them as a cross-sector transition resource, I think is really beneficial. And if you're interested in more about how we see the big strategic chunks of what New Zealand needs to do, in particular government agencies, take a look at our work with Barnes, our airline counterparts, where we've identified here some of the things that we think New Zealand should be focusing on. But I'll quickly hand over now to Georgina to pick this up from a Wellington Airport perspective. I don't know how to stop. So stop sharing. There we go. Thanks, Georgina.
Thank you. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yep, you're all good.
Perfect. Thank you, Billie. And kia ora koutou, ko Georgina tōku ingoa. Thank you, Billie, and thank you, Ara Ake, for the opportunity to present. I love talking about all the exciting things happening at Wellington Airport, and hopefully our airport presentation in combination with Jacob's and Billie's presentation gives you a good overview of things going on at different levels. I'll just give a brief overview of Wellington Airport, talk about our sustainability strategy, and then I'll talk about the hydrogen trial and then just kind of our role on the Air New Zealand Next Gen aircraft project, which we're all excited about. So Wellington Airport, being an airport is our core function, but we are also a large employer. We have around 150 staff, but there's over 2,000 workers that work on our precinct. We're also a large infrastructure provider and a lifeline utility. And as Billie's already said, we, as an airport, we have a really important role as an infrastructure provider in the aviation sector's decarbonisation journey. We're also a key connection for Wellington. And we do try and replicate the vibe of our fun capital city at our airport. It's important for us as well. So our sustainability strategy is really driven by our key targets. And as Billie said, it's really important for us to be reducing emissions in our own operations because then we can focus on helping the wider aviation sector decarbonise. Our key targets are net zero emissions for our own operations by 2030. And we're also focused on reducing potable water use, energy efficiency in our buildings, and reducing waste to landfill. We're just submitted for Airport Carbon Accreditation Level 4+, which will put us up there with all the other airports. And we do well in GRES, which is a global ESG certification. We got 96 last year, and we have a lot of projects going on to help decarbonise our own operations. So planning for the future is really important for us because we need to accommodate the projected demand increase, and Wellington population is expected to grow. Our 2040 master plan is currently being updated, and this allows for potential low emission aircraft and new and different energy sources. And so as you'll see in this plan here, I really like it replicated in our aerial view. You'll see initiatives that relate to land transport connections and aviation, and that just recognises that we are a key transport hub beyond aircraft. We have an exciting piece of work that is going to be publicly released later this month, which is our transition plan. And this represents a comprehensive strategy that builds resilience to critical uncertainties that climate change brings. And this plan really turns our sustainability strategy into actions that relate to our own operations and the wider aviation sector. And some of these are replicated on the aerial you can see in front of you. Probably one of the key takeaways from our transition planning work is there is a really strong appetite at Wellington Airport to set ourselves up as an airport that encourages innovation. And that's really shown in the way that we've done trials and implemented new technology recently. So we've had the first use of hydrogen in an airside environment in New Zealand. And as Jacob talked about, we've been selected as the main hub for the New Zealand commercial demonstrator service through competitive EOI process. So earlier this year, we trialled hydrogen fuel cell technology at Wellington Airport. Hydrogen is an important energy source on our decarb journey, and we've talked about it earlier today. The trial at Wellington Airport was a really good opportunity to test the actual infrastructure required, test public perception, and test various parts of the supply chain. So the trial was enabled through us and our partners. So I just want to thank Air New Zealand, Toyota, and Haringa, and we all worked really well together on this trial. The trial ran for 10 days, and we had 34 individual charges of Air New Zealand ground service equipment. So that's like the Air New Zealand tugs that you'll see running around our airport. We had around 30 kgs of hydrogen gas over this time, which delivered around 500 kilowatts of energy for the trial. So learnings from the trial. Over this time, just with the current supply and demand, it was around 24 times as expensive as plugging into mains power. And probably one of the key things that Billie's talked about as well is setting up anything beyond a trial is quite difficult due to a lack of existing rules and regulation around hydrogen in New Zealand. And it's widely known that there is a lack of national hydrogen strategy, which I know is being worked on, but this would be really helpful to address at the system level to help enable this happening on the ground here. Yeah, so it was really great for charging some ground service equipment, and we do really see this hydrogen being used wider when systems are become larger, and so we're connecting with Toyota and Haringa on when hydrogen fuel cell technology increases. So we are a wee while off using hydrogen to replace GA1, as Jacob talked about, but it is really important for us as an airport to get the infrastructure ready and to show our airline partners that we're getting all the things done on the ground so that they can come in and trial new technology when it is available. And the last one I'll talk about is Air New Zealand Commercial Demonstrator Service. So that'll be running between Wellington and Blenheim from 2026 with freight only initially. And this fits into Air New Zealand's wider sustainability strategy. We really do see Wellington as well placed for small electric aircraft trips, especially across the Cook Strait, and we've got a number of airports that are quite close for those connections with the smaller electric aircraft. Our role on this project is really important to provide the necessary infrastructure for the low emissions aircraft and to work closely with local, regional, national government, liaise with regulators, so CAA, and work closely with Wellington Electricity to ensure supply is there for not just the commercial demonstrator aircraft, but any sort of future electric aircraft that might be coming down the pipeline. And we're looking forward to sharing learnings with other airports in the wider sector, of course. So yeah, thank you again. Please reach out if you've got any questions. And if anyone wants to engage on any sort of future trials or trial new technology, we would also love the opportunity to collaborate with government as well.
Great. Hey, thanks, Georgina and Billy. We really appreciated your presentation. We're going to move right now to Scott Carey from NREL, which is the National Renewable Energy Lab in the USA. Hey, thanks so much, Scott, for being with us. I know that you're in a different time zone, but we're really keen to hear about your work and the international insights that you can bring, and handing over to you right now. Thanks very much. It's all yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to hear everything you have going on, and see the similarities of what's occurring across the world. I hear similar players, put it that way, that we get to work with in the US as we move through these things. Trying to get situated here to make sure everything's the way it's supposed to be. It's really close. Okay. My name is Scott Carey. I lead the Sustainable Aviation program at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. We're in Colorado, and we're roughly 3,700 people that work around primarily in sustainable transportation and renewable energy. So early stage research on solar panels, wind turbine efforts, all the way through to deployment of these systems. And then on the mobility side, working on electrification efforts for 25 plus years, starting with the early adopters on ground vehicles and moving through those systems. We're one of 17 US Department of Energy national laboratories. We're actually a nonprofit that runs US federal facilities. And we're part of that system that is there to help industry accelerate new technologies. If I can get this to move. There we go. Okay. I heard you all go through a very similar look at how we look at the energy systems around aviation. And we got to where, after we were talking to all the different stakeholders, government agencies that overlap, and all the different things that occur, is we bucketed the industry into, we have the fuels, the energy carriers, we have the airport ecosystem, which is the airspace and the locations to take off and land, and all the systems that go with that. And then we have the aircraft manufacturers. And historically, aircraft manufacturers have been in a situation that they know they have Jet A, they know they have avgas available. So they haven't had to worry about the airport system or whether there was fuel available. But as we dig deeper, as you start to say, now we want to think about PTL, or we want to think about hydrogen or electricity as different sources, there's more interaction that has to occur across those systems that haven't had to occur before. And that then ties away from just technical solutions to economic solutions, but also societal solutions. So we get into discussions, say, on how to, we have two studies that were being done. One was to look at decarbonize the LA basin, Los Angeles basin, with their utility. And then we had almost an identical study being done in Puerto Rico, a series of islands in the Caribbean that had just get ravaged by hurricanes all the time. In the Los Angeles basin, the solutions to get to net zero for them were very different than the solutions in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, they wanted their power on their house. They wanted it right where they could control it. The Los Angeles basin, exactly the opposite. We don't want to see the panels. We don't want to do these things. And that's just kind of the starting point of where that goes. And then you get into energy justice and other things that go with it. Jono, you did a great job here running through the different energy carriers. You use slightly different acronyms and words. They're the same thing. SAF are your traditional biofuel feedstocks, sustainable aviation fuel. What do you biomass? HEFA, or cooking oil, used cooking oil. Little side note on used cooking oil. Now we're getting into a discussion in the US about food or fuel debates, because virgin oils, the price of virgin oil started to rise. And we ended up in a discussion with one organization that said the Bakers Guild is really upset. The commercial bakers, the people that make bread, were upset that the cost of their oil was going up. And then you move into e-fuels, and it gets to the discussion of, okay, if you don't have a feedstock, do you have the energy? So you did a great job of running through these. And big thing that we use this graphic for is to help the different stakeholders understand their adjacent stakeholders, and that they are part of the process. Not that utility isn't bothering to provide me power. It's they have their own process they have to work through to make sure the power is on and is just as reliable as the airport is, or the aircraft is along the way. We think of airports as small cities. Try to start with this graphic and as a starting point to help people say, what's your whole system look like? And how can you balance between your existing building loads with your future transportation loads, whether those are ground vehicle conversions from ground service equipment or shuttle buses or light duty cars, but then moving into ideally into the aircraft side of this. And then what percentage of that market could potentially change if you're having to stay what we call short haul and regional flight efforts. So we'll kind of start from this. When we get into this aircraft discussion, a key thing that's been going on is that a lot of people see the great work that's occurring around the electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Great work that the aviation industry has done for years. I think they've increased efficiency something over 20% in the last 10 years of the fleet, and they're still trying to get more out of it. But now we're getting into, if you can separate the method of propulsion from how you create that energy or move that energy. An example would be if you have a turbo generator creating electricity that goes to propellers, then you start to reopen some of the solution spaces for aircraft. And so you get different answers to how an aircraft may look, efficiencies, and it's not a one-for-one comparison between the different energy carriers in terms of saying, I use this much petroleum, therefore I'll use this much electricity. Up in Vancouver, BC, we heard from Harbour Air, who converted a de Havilland Beaver, one of my favorite planes ever. I think 1930s era de Havilland Beaver float plane. They took off the rotary engine, put on an electric motor. Right now, with all those heavy batteries, it's mostly a flying battery right now, but it's moving in the right direction for what they want to do. But they found they had a 25% plus decrease in drag on the aircraft, which increased the efficiency, which then made the batteries less of an issue. So some of these things are starting to come into play as you start to move through those situations. I included at the end, I'll get these over to you all, but we did a small conference in Dallas in early April, and we went from agricultural producers to refiners, aircraft manufacturers, US airlines, airports, and federal agencies got all together and said, are we working together enough on energy, and where do we need to work together more? What are the things that are getting in the way on some of these? Some of the key things that one of the key ones that came out of the airport group specifically was adjusting our policy and regulations to account for the different energy carriers and maintain the infrastructure, essentially the infrastructure fees we use in the United States to maintain our system. So if we're not pumping jet fuel or a liquid that looks like a jet fuel, we don't necessarily get the same revenue stream if we don't set up a new revenue stream for that. So that was one of the things that popped up for us, and I'll send these over. You can get the details out of that workshop, some of the big keys that came out of that one for us at least. I'm just gonna pop up 2 quick studies that we're doing. We support both the Federal Aviation Administration and our NASA on their energy requirements around advanced air mobility, primarily around the infrastructure components. So this should be publishing in the fall, publicly available. It's looking at hydrogen demand primarily for, we're targeting the ones that are in certification in the US, or talking about certification. And those are retrofits of ATR 72s and Bombardier Q400s for us. Q400s, they're looking to take out some of the passengers, so they'd be around 50, 60 seats instead of, I think it's 70 plus in there, to get a reasonable range. But this study is saying, how do you integrate that into the airport environment? How do you know how much hydrogen you need on a daily basis? What are the different options in terms of moving those assets and safely move those assets? And then how do you look at the safety requirements if you're trying to integrate that into an existing airport system? We're also doing this is my favorite. We're partnering with NASA to look at what is a future small, for us, like a general aviation airport, so no commercial service airport. There's roughly, I think there's 4,000 of those in the United States that have land. And they have flight schools. And those are reasonable opportunities with current battery technology to convert small aircraft for flight schools, et cetera, to electric. But they're generally at the end of the electrical system. So looking at 2 different airports, we're going to model their entire airport along with, say, a 10 or a 15-year out mix of aircraft. Say, now, what would you need to do on site? What would you need from the utility? And what are some potential opportunities to potentially make revenue for some of these locations that struggle to make revenue, while also encouraging new industry or new aircraft to be brought into their existing markets. That was all I have. I have other things for you back here, and I will send those over, but I wanted to be respectful of the time, and I really appreciate being able to share what we've been doing. It's great to hear everything you all are doing. Amazing.
Thank you, Scott. That was really interesting. I've got no questions here on Slido, but if anyone wants to pop their hand up or say it straight to Scott, you're more than welcome to. Nothing there at the moment. Billie, since I still see you there, we had a couple of questions for your presentation as well, so maybe I'll just
take this down.
Yeah, okay, sure.
There you
go. Billie, is the ownership structures of airports a bonus or a barrier for the transition, do you think?
Yeah, good question. I'd say it's not a barrier as such. And some of the examples that we've shared today range from a publicly listed company, one of the biggest in New Zealand, Auckland Airport, through to an airport owned by 5 councils. And you can imagine how challenging that is. So it's not necessarily a barrier. That being said, any locally owned infrastructure has the same constraints that local councils are dealing with across the board. But I'd say we do need to look at infrastructure funding models. In as far as possible, the aviation system embeds costs in pricing. But where that isn't possible, particularly for smaller and regional airports, there is the need for other funding processes. So, for instance, we do have 5 joint venture airports that the Crown still needs to fund OPEX and CAPEX costs. That funding hasn't gone up for a long time, and we do know inflation has certainly hit us. And in most other countries, there are long-term funds that airports can apply to support infrastructure transition and upgrades, even things like runway resurfacing, for instance. We've relied over time on more bespoke models in New Zealand, like the PGF, for instance, which have served airports pretty well, I have to say, but they are bespoke things that we can't really predict for the future. So we will need to think about, what funding mechanisms should be available for smaller airports to help with their transition to alternative fuel infrastructure.
Interesting, thank you. I have one more question here for you as well. What challenges are you seeing with producing and storing hydrogen at airports?
Another great question. I think Georgina covered some of that pretty well, so I might invite Georgina to potentially make some comments on that. Would you like to address this one, Georgina?
Yeah, of course. I can speak to Wellington Airport. All the airports have kind of different constraints, and as you saw, we've got 130 hectare site compared to I think Christchurch Airport is 230 hectares, even though got kind of similar-ish passenger numbers. So just because of our small footprint and we're an airport based in the city, we have pretty limited space for actually renewable energy generation. So if that's, hydrogen, solar or anything. So I think that is going to be a key one for us, is where is the hydrogen actually going to be made and how are we going to get it there? Yeah, hopefully that answers the question. That's probably a key one, as well as what I talked about, the strategy and the rules of regulation.
Yeah, we obviously know that closer to the use is always going to be best, but yeah, every airport has a different geographical location or other kind of issues. There will be some that are really well placed. So for instance, the proximity of Tauranga Airport to the port, for instance, creates a really interesting situation there for cross-sector collaboration potentially. Wellington has a unique kind of metropolitan aspect to it, and so there's that. We often talk about, some of the no regrets moves for airports include, just make sure you keep some space, and think about what land you're able to procure around you for some of these needs, and some are better positioned than others. And then of course upfront costs, if we are getting to the space of things like electrolyzers. There are kind of upfront costs and risks to manage there. But some of the work Wellington's doing will help to start kind of unpacking that. And the more we can get specific about what we're doing, the more we can start to narrow what we see as constraints and challenges and really try and address them.
Nice, thank you. Jono.
So I have a question. It's for effectively all of the other presenters. Chris Burgess from NZ Trade and Enterprise asked a question about how open the new government is to SAF mandates and what needs to happen. I'm more interested in the second question from both the New Zealand perspective of where we currently don't have one, and also, Scott, the US perspective of where I know in the US, not necessarily mandates, but incentives starting to happen to use SAF. So I wanted to get an understanding of what has to happen and what is happening elsewhere, so we can try and get some learnings from that.
Happy to kick it off, particularly, and others to feed on. I mean, I think this is a constant discussion. Is the government open to it? I think there's still some discussions to be had around the role of government. I think there's still a bit of a hesitation around why does the government need to get involved? The answer is the government will have to be involved. We do need a policy package. We are not special around the world. Everyone else, has made that call or is in the process. We are seeing movements in China, Southeast Asia now, and New Zealand will have the same issues we'll have to deal with. So we do have to get into that conversation about the right policy package for New Zealand. I guess my view is that this is a global market, this is a global trend. It's all going to happen around us. What's the New Zealand need and position within all of that? So, for instance, Australia, the equation is really easy for them to see. They're going through some of that policy process now, but from an industry perspective, we can see in Australia huge potential for SAF production. If they don't create a domestic industry, the incentive is to send that offshore for processing, and they'll have to buy it back. The airlines will have to buy it back. And so that will make no sense to Australia. The same kind of logic can apply to many countries. So that it's really important New Zealand goes through that feasibility study to understand what proportion of SAF requirements could come from a domestic industry, so that we're not left in a situation where a global price for that feedstock, for instance, sends it all offshore.
That's an issue.
But welcome others to comment.
Well, we've got a question for Scott. Rosie, could you, I think this one come through, which I think is really interesting from Chris as well. Not sure it's Chris Burgess or not.
Yes. Scott, quick question for you. Are you seeing more e-fuel projects being proposed in the US following a push for CO2 capture through the IRA?
Not yet. And the reason is right now the traditional biofuels is more cost effective to do than they go to power to liquids currently, is the general consensus. I think that's the key thing that's going on. We know we have a lot of feedstock, and so it's how do you actually make that system work well is the struggle right now. If we didn't have to worry about that and we had abundant electricity, then it might be a different story. But that's kind of our story. And if you have different feedstocks in different situations, each location, it's kind of site dependent. So.
Thank you. And just while I've got you, I've got another one here for you. Plenty of people that are skeptical of aviation's efforts to dramatically reduce emissions. What gives you confidence the sector will make the transition?
Well, first thing that I look to, and this doesn't have a political flavor, and this is one of the things I like, and this is just me, this is Scott Carey talking. Efficiency doesn't have a political flavor, and efficiency helps airlines be cost effective. And so most of these transitions that are occurring, when you go to these advanced carriers and new engine types and things, improve efficiency, which makes it easier to operate. So it's good for many different reasons, and it also decarbonizes, which is great too. So that's kind of my approach and my thought process. We go through that. It's kind of where I come from.
Thank you. Jonathan, I'll hand it back over to you now.
Great. Hey, thanks Rosie and Scott for those answers. We're coming to a wrap up now in the next couple of minutes. So I've asked Billie if she could just give some closing comments. Thanks so much, Billie, for your participation in this and helping bring it together as well.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks everyone for your contributions today. Look, I think just bouncing off Scott's comments just now, one of the things to bank, I think, in this conversation is look how much is going on from industry without them being required to. And that sets us off on such a good track. International emissions aren't in our target, and yet we are moving as far as we can, just the technology allows. And with some further tailwinds, we will continue, and I'm very confident about that. Some of the themes we've talked about today include who gets what. The question posed by Jono at the start of our session, and it's such a fascinating one. It leads us to considerations around, what the market response is going to be as sectors scale up their need for renewable energy and biofuels, and what really are our choices. Do we want to control that? What are our choices? What's the role of government and what's the role of the market in defining that future? And I think it also prompts us to look at, what does our end-to-end emissions reduction look like? We've spent a lot of effort on quick wins. Now we're getting into hard to abate sectors, and what has the system that we've created mean in terms of addressing those hard to abate sectors now? We've also talked about the energy and aviation ecosystems working together. And for me, that's a government challenge and an industry challenge. What are the new ways of working that we need to think about in order to succeed? If we were really good at this, what would our discussions look like? Would they look different from the way that we come together at the moment? SAF, huge overarching issue. And we've talked a bit about the global trends in that space. Air New Zealand hustling hard, getting what they can, but it's slim pickings out there as the industry slowly scales up its production. There's a New Zealand policy question to be considered on this around the market signals needed and bridging that cost gap. Jacob talked about how other markets are incentivising use to address the cost gap now, and that's happening today, which is hugely encouraging, but also shows how far we've got to go. I think there's also a theme for us on what's New Zealand's edge in all this. The very high percentage of renewable energy, for instance, is ESAF going to be our edge in the future? What collaboration opportunities can we leverage? And the challenges around short-range domestic flights, what edge does that give us around our technology contribution to the global effort? And Scott, so great to have you as part of this discussion as well. It's a wonderful reminder, I think, that we can get really embedded in the New Zealand challenges, but also, 80% of our questions on this are going to be answered by international partners. Everyone's got the same challenges. How do we partner in a way that gets that insight through to us so we can focus on the New Zealand distinct issues? And I know I'm going to be emailing you very soon about those airport energy nodes work, because there will be airports on this call who are very interested in that. But my main message out of all this, and I want to thank everyone for giving me a little bit of a mouthpiece today, is that theme. You hear a lot of this in aviation at the moment globally, radical cooperation. The challenge is huge. We have to find ways of radically cooperating, not in a normal way of having these wonderful Teams calls, but it's going to need new ways of coming together. So let's push hard. And I think Jono put in his presentation, I'm sure the others reflect this, be in touch. Do you want to collaborate? Get in touch with us. Make sure that we can come away from these discussions with some action as well as just some insights, and as we head into lunchtime. So think about what you might want to do now to keep this conversation going with us. Thanks.
Great. Hey, what a great wrap up, Billy. Thanks so much indeed. And can I say thanks to all of our presenters, Jono Barnard from Ara Ake, Jacob Snelgrove from Air New Zealand, Billie Moore, of course, from Chief Executive in New Zealand Airports Association, Georgina Blane from Wellington, and Scott, thank you for coming in from Denver. We really appreciate that, and enjoy the rest of your evening.